Good afternoon. I'm Gregg Jamison, and on behalf of my collaborator, Dr. Akinori Uesugi, I'm very pleased to be able to present this video recording of our presentation entitled Diachronic Perspectives on Seal Production Strategies of the Indus Tradition, New Insights into Organization, Integration, and Variation. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge all of the institutions and individuals on the screen for supporting various aspects of our work, particularly the organizers and supporters of the conference, Archaeological Sciences Center at IIT Gandhinagar, especially Professor Dr. V.N. Prabhakar, as well as Dr. Professor Jonathan Mark Knoyer, and especially the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. Seals are important material culture of the Indus tradition that are very well known by many scholars. We use multifaceted approaches to build on earlier research, specifically focusing on diachronic variation. Exploring and interpreting variation in seals is useful to investigate Indus integration, organization, and especially change over time. Our approaches include multifaceted, complementary research methods designed to examine a wide variety of issues, including production, change over time, and what seals can help us understand about Indus organization and integration. We are principally concerned with investigations of typology, chronology. We use ethno and experimental studies, formal and technological analyses of iconography and inscriptions to investigate and explore variation. In order to conduct our excavations, we've developed a database which currently contains over 2,600 seals from 53 different sites, which cover all phases and subphases of the long Indus tradition. At present, we've identified 12 principal types that are distinguished by a variety of factors, including raw materials, morphology, iconography, chronology, and this is necessary to manage and study nearly 2,000 years of Indus seals spanning the pre-urban, urban, and post-urban periods. We also use our database for a wide variety of queries. It's a FileMaker database. It's very useful for exploring spatial distribution patterns using ArcGIS, as well as more advanced statistical analyses. I'd like to briefly summarize current results of our research, starting with seals of the urban period. To date, we've got 159 of these in our database from 9 different sites, most of which have geometric motifs. However, in spite of the small sample size, we have identified variation principally in the form of morphology and iconography, some of which you can see pictured on the table here. And what this suggests is that even as early as the pre-urban period, production was developed in different areas. In what we define as the northern region, steatite was the dominant raw material. We can see a much greater range of iconographic elements, including some of the earliest animal motifs, whereas in what we define as the southern region, we can see that terracotta is a more dominant raw material. There's greater morphological variation. However, there are some connections between the two regions that demonstrate interregional connections even during the pre-urban period. When we look at the distribution of seals from the pre-urban period, we can see the emergence of 2 distinctive styles with some connections and possible links to sites and regions further to the west. And what this suggests is variable production and interregional relationships beginning during the pre-urban period. It's also very briefly worth noting that the northern group has similarities to the steatite square seals of the urban period, which we'd like to turn to next. The overwhelming majority of our database is comprised of seals assigned to the urban period. We have over 2,400 from 42 different sites. Because of the fact it's much larger and has more seals from more sites, it is much more variable. And therefore, since we're interested in variation, our primary research focus is on seals of the urban period. One of the ways that we have tried to investigate, examine, and classify this variation is to create different categories that we've identified. concerning variation. I'm going to very briefly go through these. The first is morphology and iconography. The second is production and operational sequences. The third is diachronic variation. And the fourth, which I'll spend a little more time talking about, is carving styles. Most Indus seals of the urban period are square, but not all of them are. There are well-known examples of, say, for example, rectangular seals, a few exceptional examples of circular and or cylinder seals, like those pictured on the screen here. And this is an important but often marginalized or ignored source of variation. Iconography also varies considerably. There are many different themes, including a wide variety of different zoomorphic representations, anthropomorphic representations, as well as geometric and other representations, and a very small number of seals that have no iconography at all, just inscriptions. So iconography itself can be also seen as an important source of variation of seals from the urban period. When we look at distribution patterns by animal iconography, we can also see greater evidence of variation than has normally been addressed. Some of this is correlated with regional and or diachronic patterns, and we can also see further evidence of spatial variation in the distribution of raw materials and analyses of production methods. During the urban period, a wide variety of raw materials were used to make seals. Although steatite is by far the most common, we know that multiple source areas were utilized during the urban period for making Indus seals and other ornaments, thanks in large part to the outstanding work of Dr. Randall Law. When we look at and compare unfired or discarded steatite from Indus sites, however, we can see that it came in a wide variety of different colors, textures, and qualities. And these are issues that Dr. Law and Professor Dr. Knoyer have been investigating for many years. Hopefully we'll be able to continue to study this in the future to try to figure out why there's so much variation in steatite raw material usage. Turning our attention to production, although we're uncertain which specific tools would have been used to carve Indus seals, ongoing studies indicate that multiple kinds of tools could have been used, and there are numerous examples recovered from archaeological sites. Our experimental and ethnoarchaeological research focusing on tool use suggests that multiple types work, but bronze is the most effective because of its durability, and different tips and edges on the tools are more effective for different kinds of carving tasks. When we look at Indus seals, we can see that a wide variety of different raw materials and firing techniques were used. Some seals appear to have been surface treated before firing to make them white, like those pictured on the upper left of the screen here. Others appear to have fired white all the way through with or without surface treatment, like the example from Bagasura on the left of the screen. Others that we can see when they are broken, primarily in section, appear to only have been partially whitened. And this demonstrates that firing and whitening methods were another source of variation in Indus seal production. We can see similar phenomenon with operational sequences. They were also variable. Sometimes inscriptions appear to have been engraved first. In other instances, iconography appears to have been engraved first. Some seals do not contain the common combination of both animal iconography and inscriptions. Some of them only have inscriptions, others only have iconography. And a few exceptional examples, including the one pictured from Bagasura on the right of the screen here, have engravings, inscriptions, and iconography on multiple surfaces or faces. Most only have these features on one face. Some of the variation we can see in operational sequences, proportions, and carving styles, which I'll talk more about momentarily, can be correlated with diachronic variation. And this is best seen through analyses of unicorn seals, which have therefore been the primary focus of our investigations. Building on earlier studies by Knoyer and Meadow, we've classified changes in unicorn seals over time using the Harappa seal chronology as a comparative tool. This variation in carving styles can be seen both visually and through technological analyses. We have been able to employ scanning electron microscope, again, building on, supporting the work of Knoyer and others. And this is providing a comparative data set for future studies to help us gain greater insights into how and why unicorn seal carving styles changed over time. When we look at the distribution of different seals based on their hypothesized chronological affiliation, we can see that early carving styles are only present at a few sites, primarily in Punjab and then Sindh, especially around Mohenjo-Daro. And then later we see them at many sites, not only throughout the entire Indus culture area, but even beyond. So morphology, production, and operational sequences, as well as diachronic variation, are important sources, but they don't explain all variation in unicorn seals. When we start to compare them, we can still see clear evidence of variability in carving styles. And the question is why? Well, some of this, we argue, can be explained by unique individual carving styles. In other words, seal carving is like handwriting. Everybody does it a bit differently. This interpretation is based on ethnoarchaeological and experimental studies focusing on Indus seal replication. These studies revealed consistent, clear evidence of unique individual idiosyncratic carving styles that each artisan had. These are consistent, patterned, and quantifiable, and using stylistic and metric analyses, it was possible to fingerprint seals made by individual artisans. These studies were then used to model and test for pattern variation in Indus unicorn seal production that were then correlated with different artisans and workshops. Testing of the model was undertaken by formal stylistic and metric analyses, primarily of animal iconography, unicorns, as well as metric proportions. And this was useful for identifying pattern variation that we argue represents the products of different artisans and workshops. The model was tested on a sample of 500 published unicorn seals from 22 different sites, resulting in the identification of stylistic groups using formal analyses. Over 50 groups comprised of nearly 180 seals, a significant proportion of the sample were identified, and they had very complex distribution patterns that help understand the nature of unicorn seal production in the Indus. The stylistic groups were assigned to all three phases or subperiods of the Harappa phase using the Harappa seal chronology, pictured at the bottom, based on the Harappa seal chronology. And this can be further tested as more seals from stratigraphically controlled contexts are published. One of the things we can see right away is that the number of stylistic groups, total seals therein, and their distribution patterns increase and become much more complex over time. Some of the groups we identified are so stylistically and proportionally alike that they may have been carved by the same hands, the same artisans. Other groups are more stylistically and proportionally variable. They demonstrate greater intragroup variation, regardless of group membership size or distribution patterns. And this suggests that perhaps they were made by multiple artisans within different workshops, or that the artisans were less skilled and experienced. The identification of single and multi-site, as well as multi-regional stylistic groups, suggests strongly that unicorn seal production, at least, was undertaken at multiple sites, probably by multiple artisans and workshops, some of whom may have been working contemporaneously at the larger urban centers. And even though seal production was likely rigidly controlled on a local scale, results of this study suggest a decentralized form of unicorn seal production and use throughout the Indus as a whole. Since completing the study of unicorns, we have been able to develop, refine, and test the model using other animal motifs, using very, very similar methods of formal analyses. And these studies have revealed comparable patterns. Carving styles of seals with other iconographies, particular animals, are diverse, yet there are examples of pattern variation, stylistically distinct groups that may have been carved by the same artisans and or workshops, a few examples of which are pictured on the screen here. More recently, we've turned our attention to formal analyses of inscriptions, not only to identify and map the distribution of duplicates, shared uses of the Indus script, but also to try to see if similar patterns observed with our formal analyses of animals apply to inscriptions. And we're expanding our sample here to include seals from multiple mediums, morphologies. Some of them have iconography, some of them don't. You can see some examples of that here. And we're also now trying to examine the inscriptions on the stylistic groups we've already investigated to see if there are patterns of co-occurrence or stylistic coherence among animals and inscriptions. This is focusing primarily on proportions, carving styles of duplicate characters. Some of them demonstrate high levels of stylistic and metric coherence, like the two tiger seals pictured on the bottom left. Others are far more variable. Moving on quickly to the seals of the post-urban period, our sample is very small, not only in terms of number, but also distribution. Although seal use continued during the post-urban period, the nature and scale was drastically different. The disappearance with seals containing animal motifs and inscriptions clearly demonstrates a decline in transformation, supporting the work of Conoyer and many others. However, we'd like to remind folks that variation is still present. Materials, morphology, and iconography are still variable. We're also particularly interested in evidence of intercultural connections after the urban period in the form of seals, which are indicative not only of long-distance relationships, but also continuities. Specifically, we're interested in investigating using our method seals from the Gulf region. Our future research goals are many. We plan to continue to conduct statistical analyses to identify and map variation. We hope to continue our technological analyses, also to investigate patterns and variation in production methods. Of course, we're also hoping to expand our database and ultimately write a book about Indus seals. In conclusion, seals were made and used in the Indus for a long time and served many functions. Collectively, they are quite diverse, and using multifaceted approaches to studying them is useful to not only explore but also explain some of this variation. Variation in seals helps us understand organization, integration, and especially change in Indus social, political, economic, and ideological systems. Such studies are necessary to advance awareness and interpretations of one of the world's earliest and most unique urban societies. Thank you.